The dog does the behavior correctly. We should reinforce the behavior, right? But how often and how regularly? Today, we are talking about schedules of reinforcement. They can be a bit confusing, but let's make them easy to understand, shall we? After that, let's answer the question, do we need to worry about them? It is Jose here from Try Me Please. Let's go. Several reinforcement schedules have been studied and described, but for this video, we will focus on the most common simple ones. First, I want you to imagine two branches or two options. On one side, we have continuous schedules, and on the other one, we have partial or intermittent schedules. Yes, one of the branches goes by two acceptable names, but we will stick with partial in this video. The simplest form of reinforcement schedule is the continuous reinforcement schedule. Every correct behavior that aligns with the established criteria receives reinforcement. For instance, the dog receives a treat each time it complies with the sit cue. Here's a human example. The salesman is compensated for each book sold. Partial schedules of reinforcement can be divided into 4 groups: fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. In a fixed ratio reinforcement schedule, reinforcement is provided after a specific number of correct responses. For instance, the dog receives a treat after completing 3 sits, FR3, or the salesman earns payment upon selling 4 books, FR4. Within a variable ratio reinforcement schedule, reinforcement occurs after a variable number of correct responses, and this variability centers around a specific average. For instance, the dog may receive a treat after sitting twice, then after sitting 4 times, and again after sitting 6 times. In this example, the average is 4, indicating a VR4 schedule of reinforcement. Similarly, in the case of the salesman, if he is compensated after selling 5, 15, and 10 books, he would be operating on a VR10 schedule, with 10 being the average number around which his payments are distributed. In a fixed interval reinforcement schedule, reinforcement occurs after a specific behavior has taken place, but only if that behavior occurs after a set duration of time. For instance, in an FI8 schedule for a dog, the first sit prompts a treat, but subsequent sits within the next 8 seconds do not result in reinforcement. After this 8-second interval, a sit will once again yield a treat. A salesman operating on a FI3 schedule would receive payment after selling a book, but subsequent book sales within the next 3 days would not result in compensation. After the 3-day interval, a book sold leads to payment once more. Within a variable interval reinforcement schedule, reinforcement is provided after a variable duration has passed. The time interval can fluctuate around a specific average. For instance, rather than consistently reinforcing the sit behavior after an 8-second interval, reinforcement may occur after 4, 8, or 12 seconds. In this scenario, the average interval is 8, designating it as a VI8 schedule of reinforcement. For a salesman, compensation might be received after selling a book after 1, 3, or 5 days, illustrating a VI3 schedule of reinforcement. Oof, that's a lot of technical explanations, isn't it? So, the next question is probably going to be, what schedule should we use? Back when I first learned about animal training and behavior modification, the standard advice was this: teach any new behavior using a continuous schedule of reinforcement and then move on to a variable schedule of reinforcement. I am convinced that most people are referring to a partial ratio reinforcement schedule when they use that expression. That idea, teach with continuous and then move to a variable, is one of the 10 laws of shaping in Don't Shoot the Dog. This is because when these schedules were being studied in labs, a partial ratio schedule of reinforcement was the one that produced more responses from the animals for fewer reinforcement deliveries. That schedule can create the highest response rate, a constant pattern of responses with minimal pauses between behaviors and the most resistance to extinction. That is, the animal will continue to do the behavior for quite a while, even when not offered reinforcers. Partial schedules will have different characteristics in terms of response rates, the pattern of responses, and resistance to extinction. With all these different schedules and their unique traits, you might be wondering, do I have to understand all these things to train my dog at home? The quick and simple answer is no, you don't. For most situations when training animals, just using a continuous reinforcement schedule is a straightforward, easy, and effective way to get the results you want. In certain cases or specific behaviors, it might make sense to keep a behavior strong by using partial reinforcement schedules. Let's say your dog learned that lying on a mat in the living room gets them reinforcement. You could maintain this behavior by occasionally reinforcing it after different amounts of time for lying on the mat. You would be using a variable interval schedule of reinforcement. If you want to train a dog to make multiple checks of a certain area of the house throughout the day, the behavior should be trained using a continuous schedule to establish a high rate of checks. Later, you could transition to a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement to maintain the behavior. It's important to note, however, that this approach would need careful planning to ensure the reinforcement rate remains high enough for the dog to stay engaged in the training. Similarly, loose leash walking could be taught using a continuous schedule of reinforcement. Later on, we can start to require a variable number of steps or a variable time elapsed between reinforcers. This would allow us to reduce the number of treats we use. We can also progress to using environmental reinforcers instead of food treats. But do this carefully and ideally with the help of a behavior consultant. You want to avoid a situation in which your dog stops trying to do the correct behavior, and this is often the result of lowering rates of reinforcement too soon or too fast. I just gave you a few examples of when you might want to consider deviating from a continuous schedule of reinforcement. To be honest with you though, in practical terms, I don't think about the terminology that heavily when teaching dogs. I just know that high rates of reinforcement produce great engagement and behavior, and also that we need to take it slow when decreasing how many reinforcers our dogs are getting. For most behaviors, if I have the opportunity to do so, I like to offer reinforcers. If I ask the dog to come to me, I will reinforce that behavior. If I ask the dog to sit by the door and they do, I like to then open the door for us to go through, an effective reinforcer for the sitting behavior. Let me read you something from a timeless article by Bob and Marion Bailey. Quote, "Let us begin by clearly stating our own philosophy about continuous versus ratio schedules. This philosophy can be quite simply put: if you do not need a ratio, do not use a ratio. Or, in other words, stick to continuous reinforcement unless there is a good reason to go to ratio." Unquote. Karen Pryor Clicker Training also updated their 10 laws of shaping, and it no longer includes the reference to putting behaviors on a variable ratio schedule. Additionally, most of the research about schedules of reinforcement was completed using a setup or situation that is quite a bit different to how we train dogs. We won't go into that here, but if you are interested in this, simply look up free operant versus discrete trial. There will be some additional information and resources in the description below. I've got a super important message coming up in just a second. But first, could you please click the like button below so that this information reaches more people? Cute photo as a thanks. In some realms of animal training, it is relatively common for trainers to click or mark every correct behavior, but then only reinforce with a backup reinforcer some of those correct responses. Animals can learn that way and do adapt to learn in that style of training. However, according to all the research I've done on that topic, that is a suboptimal way to go about it. If you use a bridging stimulus, you should back it up with another reinforcer every time. So, what do I want you to leave this video with? Well, for starters, the most important aspects of effective dog training are still good antecedent arrangement and positive reinforcement. Second, teach dogs using a continuous schedule of reinforcement, and most behaviors will be well maintained on it. Third, there are certain situations in which we might want to consider alternatives to decrease how many reinforcers we offer. For those, we should be careful about how quickly we make that transition. I've made a nice, super affordable digital flyer that summarizes the information about schedules of reinforcement. I will leave it in the description below. That would be a fabulous way to contribute to the work that I do here on YouTube. Finally, I want to know that you watched the video to this point. Could you please leave me a comment with the keyword schedules? Next, I recommend that you watch my video about operant conditioning. Muito obrigado e grande abraço. Tchau!